Hello. Good evening to those in the East and good afternoon to those in the West. Welcome to our webinar titled Integrating Vitreoretinal Services into the ASC. My name is Praveen Dugal. I'm a retina specialist in Phoenix, Arizona. We have a terrific panel of experts to talk to you about the pros and cons of integrating vitreoretinal surgery into the ASC. So we have a lot of content here, so I'd like to get started without much further ado and introduce our very first speaker. Please note that there will be a question and answers period at the end of all the talks, so please do submit that through the webinar, and I'll try and get to as many questions as possible, but that'll be after all the speakers are done with their talks. So our first speaker is Michael Romanski. Mike has been practicing healthcare law and been a lobbyist since 1997. For nearly 30 years, he's represented the ASC and surgical specialty organizations, currently serving with OOSS as the Washington Counsel and Vice President for Corporate Development. Michael Romanski. Mike?
Thanks a lot, and good evening to all of you. Praveen, in prepping for this today, I was reflecting upon how far ophthalmology has come in terms of adopting the ASC as a site of service for eye surgery. I was thinking back to the first time I sat down with OOSS leaders and members. It was 29 years ago, this academy meeting. And I realized that when I addressed the group, there were fewer ophthalmic ambulatory surgery centers in the country than there are represented on this webinar at this moment. There are now close to 1,000. And I was thinking back to 1982, the year before I had started working with OOSS. Medicare had just initiated a new program to pay ASCs a facility fee. The facility fee for cataract at that time, this is hard to believe, was $336. And even with inflation, it was nowhere near enough to cover facility costs. Now, the doc's professional fee, for those of you who were practicing then, was a generous $2,500. And these fees essentially subsidized the surgery center. The meager facility fee was essentially a loss leader to bring in more professional fees. And how things have changed when you think about it. Today, the cataract professional fee is about $600, and the facility fee for the cataract operation is just under $1,000. The professional fee has in many respects now become the loss leader to bring in more facility fees because the ASC has become the most profitable part of most ophthalmology organizations. And, I think we're talking here tonight about making it more profitable and at the same time delivering high-quality care to the Medicare beneficiary. What OOSS has focused on for the past 3 decades is ensuring that the ASC is able to deliver the highest quality care in a cost-effective manner and generate a fair income to the surgeon owners. And through commitment over the years of a visionary leadership and the allocation of funds for professional lobbying, thank you all very much, the effective grassroots efforts by you, our members, liaison with other organizations with common interests, and the donation of political action committee money to targeted allies on Capitol Hill, we've been fortunate to date to accomplish a number of objectives that are really relevant in our discussion today. We've seen the list of procedures that can be performed in an ASC expanded to include virtually every eye service. Vitreoretinal services were not even on the list for the first 2 decades of this program. We've seen steady growth in facility reimbursement because now we receive annual payment updates and because our rates are linked to those of the hospital. And we've also been successful in blocking efforts by Pete Stark and others to prohibit you from referring your patients to your ASC. And the effect of these efforts has been positive. ASC facility fees, in contrast to your physician fees, have grown at a modest and steady rate. They have never declined, and ASC reimbursement is kind of unique in that sense among all healthcare providers. And remarkably, compared to 30 years ago, 2/3 of all ophthalmic surgical cases are now performed outside of the hospital and in the ambulatory surgical center. And that's why 5,300 ASCs exist in this country, and about 1/5 of those perform predominantly eye cases. So I wanted to talk a little bit about trends. Why is it that we're here today? Well, because there are a number of trends that indicate that not only has surgical technique, equipment, and instrumentation developed in such a way as to make the VR procedures more safe and effective in the non-hospital environment, and I'm not going to speak to those, so too has the Medicare payment system itself. You know, there were very, very few ASCs performing VR about 6 years ago. Doctors Dougal and Gonzalez, who are speakers tonight, were among the two of a handful who were doing it. And why were there so few? Well, that's because there wasn't any money for it. For a number of the highest volume, currently high volume codes, there was no Medicare facility fee paid 5 years ago. These procedures weren't even deemed to be fit for performance in the ASC. And for those services that were paid by Medicare, like 67036, removal of retina fluid, 67040, vitrectomy, and 67108, repair of the detached retina, the rates were between $850 $950. Very few facilities could survive at those reimbursement rates. There were big changes in the ambulatory surgery center payment program 5 years ago. Rates became tied to the hospital payment system. And now these services are paid typically about $1,630, almost between 70 and 100% more than they were 5 years ago. So the payment trend being on the upswing is a very, very important one. So the approximate doubling in payment rates has provided incentives for ASCs to seek out the VR cases, and many, many more facilities are doing so. Medicare data reflect that case volume from 2008 to 2011, that's just a 3-year period, increased by about 29% in ASCs, and that ASC's market share vis-a-vis the hospital has increased by 30%, growing at about 10% per year. And these growth rates are accelerating. OOSS surveyed its members, and we discovered that at least 60% of our members either now offer VR or plan to add these cases in the near future. That's up from infinitesimal numbers just 5 years ago. So what do we need to think about in determining whether to join an existing ASC, either as a surgeon with medical staff privileges or taking an ownership interest, or consider in developing a new ASC? Well, we've talked a little bit about the payment factors, and let me just say a few words more. Rates have increased substantially over the past several years for the VR services as the new ASC payment system was phased in. And as others will attest, I think, on the call tonight, VR, if integrated appropriately, can be a lucrative new service offering with the case volume accelerating very, very intensively. Going forward, increases in payment rates will be modest, but they're going to exist. And I think it's highly unlikely that ASC payment rates for all eye care services are going to actually decline. Why is this? Because hospital rates, which are recalibrated each year, and which ASCs derive their payments from, tend to increase each year. And ASCs also now receive an annual update of the CPI Urban Index. Now, we are lobbying in the ASC community to receive the same slightly higher cost of living adjustment which is afforded hospitals. And I'm optimistic that at some point in the near future we'll receive that. Now, there are, I have to be honest, several things that give me some pause for concern. With a massive federal deficit, it is always conceivable that Congress will reduce the annual updates to all providers. Again, I wouldn't expect a target on ASCs, but all providers could be subject to across-the-board cutbacks. And ironically, Congress's effort to pay for another short-term SGR fix, something that would benefit all of you on this call, could be a robbing Peter to pay Paul type effort. MedPAC, the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, is right now considering a proposal that would substantially reduce hospital rates for procedures that are commonly performed in the physician's offices, and those would include the YAG, argon, and other low-intensity, low-end services. Well, if the rates are reduced to hospitals, because there's big savings to be attained there, our rates would also be cut back as well. Nobody's going to permit ASCs to be paid more than hospitals. Now, another important consideration, regulatory consideration in investing in an ASC is this one. I am often asked whether I think that policymakers will act to prohibit doctors from referring patients to their own ASCs. If they were to do this, there would essentially be no more ASCs because about 90% of ambulatory surgical centers are owned by physicians. I believe that we will, at OOSS and the ambulatory surgery community, we will continue to prevail in making the case that physician ownership of ASCs saves rather than costs the Medicare program, and that our right to own these centers will be preserved. Let's face it, a big challenge for ASCs the past few years has been compliance with the Medicare conditions for coverage that were revised in 1979 and which have been rigorously enforced against ophthalmic ASCs, at times to absolutely preposterous ends, but that's a subject for another talk. If you're new to the ASC arena and you're considering developing a facility, you want to take a close look at these regulations that govern the standards for infection control, quality assurance, patient rights, governance, staffing, life safety, medical records. That's just naming a few. If you're simply integrating VR into an existing ophthalmic ASC, I don't think that compliance with the Medicare conditions for coverage are going to be any more or less extensive than you're used to. Now again, whether you're developing a new center or adding VR to an existing facility, bear in mind that starting 22 days ago, all ambulatory surgery centers are required to report on a half dozen quality measures for each procedure performed. These include patient falls, wrong site, wrong implant, burns, patient burns, and this would apply to laser procedures, patient transfers to hospitals, and timing of the administration of IV prophylactic antibiotics. And yes, you have to report on that one, even though ophthalmic facilities never use IV prophylactic antibiotics. If you don't report, the ASC will be subject to a 2% reduction in subsequent years' annual payment updates. Now, going forward, I'm quite certain that given the high volume of ophthalmic procedures performed in ASCs, about 40% of all services performed in ASCs across the country are ophthalmic. I'm quite certain that there will ultimately be an ophthalmic-specific quality measure. I can assure you that OOSS, working with the AAO and the ASCRS, will be integrally involved in ensuring that it's an appropriate quality measure. I think it's fair to say also that VR being relatively low volume, it will not be an quality outcome that relates specifically to VR. So also keep an eye on electronic health reporting. There are currently no incentives for putting EHR in the ASC. Likewise, to date, there are no penalties for not doing so. So these are the major regulatory issues. If you followed OOSS, if you're a member of OOSS, and I hope you are, and if you're not, that you'll join, you have a sense of what our regulatory agenda is. Clearly, one of the major components is to level the playing field between hospitals and ASCs. They are a big lobby, and we like the benefit of tying ourselves to their coattails. We want to see the rates harmonized with hospital outpatient departments. We want to receive the same annual update factor as hospitals. We are looking for changes that make sense in the new quality reporting program. We also feel that if we're being penalized for not meeting the quality measures, we also ought to get paid bonuses for good results, and that's the value-based purchasing agenda item. All in all, I am very, very bullish on integrating VR into the ASC. Medicare has doubled reimbursement, and it's often a smart bet to just follow the money. So that's all I've got, Praveen.
Mike, that was terrific, as usual. Thank you very much. And please do send the questions that you have for Mike. We'll have time at the end to engage in a question-and-answer session. The next is a slightly different point of view. It's Jay Pepose, and Jay has been really a pioneer in a lot of things that he's done, but particularly in integrating vitreoretinal surgery into an existing cataract ASC. Jay is the founder and director of the Pepose Vision Institute and professor of clinical ophthalmology at Washington University School of Medicine and president of the Lifelong Vision Foundation. Jay?
Thank you so much, Praveen, and I'd like to welcome everyone who's online. So I'd like to talk today about how we integrated vitreoretinal surgery into our existing ASC. And I'd like to start by discussing finding the right retinal surgeon for your ASC. And I'd like to compartmentalize this into recruitment to the ASC and recruitment to the practice, because obviously finding the right person is very important in terms of the reputation of the ASC, profitability of the ASC, and being part of integrating into part of a team. And of course, the staff at the ASC is not used to performing vitreoretinal surgery, and so there are some challenges to this, and it can be easily met in a stepwise fashion. So first, recruitment to the ASC. You want to find a competent surgeon, very important. Obviously, you want to have someone who is going to elevate the reputation of the ASC, not going to have patients coming back for repeat surgeries. And you want to find an efficient surgeon, which doesn't necessarily equate to the fastest surgeon. So you want to have someone who's meticulous, methodical, efficient. You don't want to have someone who has been asked by 3 hospitals not to come back because the cases are taking 4 or 5 hours. So I think that it's important to do due diligence in finding out who that person may be, what characteristics in the OR does that person have. And the best way of doing that, in my mind, is call operating room nurses, because they're the ones who see all the surgeons and probably have the closest and probably the most objective opinion. And you want to have someone who's appreciative of the staff, who is thankful of being there, who thanks the staff. You want to have someone who has a good attitude and is not going to create problems. And perhaps you might lose staff and good staff if you have people who turn out to create conflicts. So I think these are all important things to look for in recruiting a vitreoretinal surgeon to work in the ASC. Now, the other aspect is recruitment to the practice, because you might want to recruit a vitreoretinal surgeon to the practice, and then that surgeon will also work in the ASC. And so here, again, you have a few other things to consider in recruiting that person to your practice. Obviously, you want them to be competent. You want them to share the core values of your practice. If you have a practice that prides itself on patient care, patient satisfaction, you want to be sure they share those values. If you have a practice that likes to do clinical research, again, you want to be sure that it's the right person, the right fit. This is a marriage, and you want to be sure that it fits your goals. You want to have someone who's eager to participate in activities that grow the practice. You want to be sure that they're amenable to meeting other doctors and maybe doing things that will grow the practice. It may be education, it may be optometric networking, it may be cultivating referral sources. There can be referral issues. I mean, obviously, if you have a person coming into your practice, vitreoretinal surgeon, it may limit some referrals, but you may also gain referrals from other sources. Many retinal practices do not have the experience of marketing that many anterior segment practices, particularly those that are strong in refractive surgery, have. And so this benefits the retinal surgeon by becoming part of the team, and you kind of benefit by sharing the patina. And it also it creates new opportunities for clinical research, because I think that there are many studies now that require both an anterior and posterior segment surgeon to be part of a team to qualify for these studies. So I think there's many opportunities that will continue to arise. So I think these are the high points, I think, to look for in recruitment to the vitreoretinal surgeon to the ASC and or to your practice. Now, the case mix is also very critical. For example, ideal cases are cases that can be done in an efficient way. Puckers, holes, peels, relatively controlled diabetics with retinopathy. Less cost-effective cases are cases that may require general anesthesia. Very long cases that require silicone or perfluorocarbon. Diabetics who are basically out of control or have never been appropriately treated. They have extensive diabetic retinopathy. It may be very prolonged cases. These are less cost-effective. We don't cherry pick our cases, but again, I think these are things to consider. We have found it profitable to bring lasers into the ASC. And the other thing that we have learned, being up to about a year and a half ago, primarily or exclusively an anterior segment ASC, is that the ASC may have negotiated with certain carriers focused completely on anterior segment reimbursement, cataract and other types of cases, but basically you may not have focused at all on what the reimbursement was for retinal cases because you weren't doing any. And so it's very important to review these contracts, because your administrator may have focused exclusively on the reimbursement for the cataract and other anterior segment cases and basically agreed to low reimbursements for vitreoretinal cases, figuring there'd be no impact, but now there is. And so it's important to review those. In certain circumstances, you may find that the reimbursement could be even lower than Medicare, and these can be renegotiated. So that's something that we learned in these situations. Now, how to start the integration? We found that the best way was building block time, meaning we started with a half-a-day block time, which followed the anterior segment surgery. The anterior segment surgery is usually very predictable. These are rapid turnover cases, and usually the end time is pretty certain. And so we found it was most effective to follow the anterior segment, so like the afternoon. And we run the cases out of one room. Remember, these cases have far fewer room turnovers than an anterior segment case. The transition of the staff was very critical. And I think that this is what makes or breaks it during this early transition. You want to have a training period with the team from the vitreoretinal manufacturer to train the staff as to the use of the equipment. But beyond that, we actually paid to have an outside proctor come in and train the staff, spent several days training the staff, getting into the flow, doing mock cases. This was really very important in making everyone feel comfortable. And then the first few days of the surgery, we paid to have the proctor come in, and we asked for the vitreoretinal manufacturer's representative to come in and be present for the first few days of surgery. And that really facilitated the transition. And you want to be sure that the staff pays extra attention to things that they're not used to. Drawing up gas, handling buckles, all these things really make a big difference. And you want them to gain confidence. And so these first few days are critical in their gaining confidence. And, it's very important. Now, what are some of the advantages for the staff? Well, they do gain this new competency. They feel a sense of growth. There's a variety now to their day. It's not just, cataract after cataract after cataract. So they do feel that there's a variety. And, we've heard that they feel like it's a cool surgery. The view is different. It's cool. What they view as the instruments, the toys are cool. So we found that it really did perk things up, and the staff really, I think, is very appreciative. And, of course, the patients are very appreciative as well. It's a different type of patient than the average cataract patient. So we found that there were many advantages for the staff as well. There is a value of a premium combination vitreoretinal device. We have a device that does both anterior and posterior segment, and we found that this was very cost-effective. It was better in terms of the footprint in the room. It was a much smaller footprint than having two devices, two instruments. The staff was already familiar with the basic use of the device, and so this was more of this was a smaller step for them to take, and they felt more comfortable more quickly because they were used to the basic device itself, how to cycle through, but there still were things that they were not familiar with, and they had to become more acquainted with. They weren't familiar with, having to use nitrogen and things of that nature. So, but there was a true value to us in the combination vitreoretinal machine, because in the morning we would be using it for cataract, in the afternoon we were using it for vitreoretinal surgery. And there's a tremendous value to adding retina for the patient's perspective in terms of patient satisfaction. In our particular setting, the ASC is adjacent to the practice, so it's one-stop shopping. But even in the ASC, these patients, many of them had cataract surgery, and so they're used to going to the ASC. They know where it is. They get the feeling that it's a one-stop shop. If you add vitreoretinal services to your practice, you're probably adding diagnostics that you didn't have before, perhaps fluorescein angiography or other things that might not have been available. It certainly adds to better patient education. Now you have a vitreoretinal expert who can educate your patients regarding their conditions, whether it be diabetes or macular degeneration and so forth. So this adds again to the reputation of the practice. The surgery may again be at the same place. So even in terms of location, that's important. The patient's familiar with how to get there. They may recognize staff from both, and actually, it is possible, that staff may be working in both facilities at different times. So these things make the facility more friendly to the patient. It differentiates the practice and the ASC's full service, and you want to provide a premium experience. And it does make for lots of cross-referral. I know in my practice, we're always referring patients to retina, and retina is referring patients back. So, and then patients then identify with both doctors. So I think it's a win-win for all parties involved.
Thank you, Jay. That was excellent from a cataract perspective. Next, Victor Gonzalez, my friend Victor Gonzalez, who is the founder of Valley Retina Institute and founder and managing partner of McAllen Surgical Specialty Center, who will give us the retina perspective. And I remind the audience again, please do submit your questions. We'll try and, there are a lot of questions coming in. Please go ahead and have them come in, but we'll try and get to them at the very end. Victor, go ahead.
Thank you, Praveen. I'm going to give you a little different perspective. We started our first surgical center back in 2001, so we were early to transition, and actually our surgical center was primarily a retina-based surgical center. So it was unique in that, as Mike already alluded to, the reimbursement at that time was not very favorable. There were a couple of other underlying reasons why we needed to do that. There were a lot of cash patients that were available to us. We're close to the border, so we had the ability to market to those patients and get a decent mix to make ourselves survive. As it was already discussed, there's been an important change in the number of vitreoretinal cases that are being performed at the surgical center, and amongst the reasons, the most important one probably is the fact that the reimbursements and the number of procedures that are covered have significantly improved, making these type of surgical centers much more viable. For example, back in 2001, a basic vitreoretinal procedure was, we were getting reimbursed $630 for a procedure. So, of course, we were very selective in terms of which cases we performed there. And anything that required heavy liquids, siliconol, etc., would result in a loss. So those cases were still being referred to the hospital. Having the ability to access some of the cash patients from across the border and in our region, we were able to develop a good mix that allowed us to continue to operate. We did not realize that the change in the structure of payment was going to take so long, but fortunately there were some lessons that we learned, and I hope I can pass these along to give you an idea of how it is that we were able to make it with these type of reimbursements. Mike's already discussed the fact that there's been a significant increase in the number of cases, so I'll just go through these slides to save some time. But basically, the most important change, as I already alluded to, was the fact that our standard procedure increased from about $630 back in as close as 2007 to over $1,500 now. So there's been a very significant increase in the reimbursement that we receive for the same procedures we were doing back before these changes occurred. So what we did back then was we developed very, very selective ways of bringing the procedures into the surgical center. We were primarily a retina group of 6. All of us were doing the procedures there, and what we did very early on is that we amongst the group decided how the cases were going to be divided. There were some of us who were very efficient and had very good outcomes in macular holes and epiretinal membranes, and then there's some of us who actually like the heavy-duty tractional cases and the what tend to be longer, complicated cases. For this reason, what happens within the group is that the surgeons that are more efficient and have the good outcomes with the complicated cases get those referred to them. They're allowed, obviously, to do any macular holes or macular puckers, but within the group, it was very easy for us to decide to do that. Now, early on, we did not run into any complications with our referring anterior segment docs because along the mix of surgeons that we had, initially we did not have any cataract surgeons. But I can tell you that as time went along, it just made a lot of sense, and our own referring anterior segment docs that did not have a surgical center, came, met with us, and and we were able to have a very good relationship and growth by allowing them to come in into the surgical center. So now I think it's already been discussed, from an anterior segment standpoint, what to look for, and in terms of if you're a surgeon that wants to come into a surgical center, what are the things that really attracted the surgical center setting for us? Well, there is less turnover in personnel, and one of the most frustrating things that we had at the hospital was that every time we went to do a surgery, I had to teach the staff how to do the procedure, how to set up the machine. And the fact that you have less turnover at the surgical center, the staff is more familiar with the procedures, this in turn just makes you more efficient. There's better turnover times. And for me, the increased efficiency in the OR allowed me to do more cases in the same time period that I was at the hospital. And the free time that I had after, I could either see more patients in the office or go and play golf and enjoy myself. And I think this was nice having that type of option. The patients, I can tell you, are much more comfortable. It's, the environment is less threatening and much more friendly. And as I already alluded to, this gives you more access to cash paying patients. And I'm not only talking about people who do not have any type of insurance, but you can imagine a patient who's a Medicare only patient who does not have a secondary. There's a big difference, 20% in the bill from the hospital versus 20% in a bill from the surgical center, and this has been very important for the patients in my region. And of course, if you're an investor in a surgical center, you have the potential for some ancillary income. Now, what are the advantages to the patient? I sincerely believe that, the fact that we're doing these procedures over and over again really does improve the safety for the patient. I already pointed out the fact that it really is less expensive for the patient. The patient benefits from a quicker, more efficient surgery, which tends to decrease the intraoperative complications dealing with issues like, the staff not knowing how to turn on the air the correct way, et cetera. And again, both the patient and the family and on our quality surveys, they routinely say, this environment made us comfortable as the family and the patient comfortable in the ORs. So what are the factors to consider if you're considering doing this? Well, don't just jump in and go and buy all these equipment, because there are a number of equipment that are required for you to set up a modern vitreoretinal operating room. You have to remember that you have potentially a new vitrectomy unit if you don't have a combined one. There's some cryo units. You need a laser. There's some handheld instruments, and there are different options with those. Both disposable and reusable. The retina cases do take longer than the cataracts. There's a higher cost per procedure, although there is a higher reimbursement per procedure if you have a right mix of cases. And of course, you're going to need to train your staff. Now, what did we do to try and make ourselves survive? Well, we're from Texas. I'm from Texas, and we had the Dell mentality, and that is, we did not want to have a lot of supplies sitting on the shelf. We were very good about making sure that we had a good inventory control. We had someone who's excellent at ordering and really calculated to a T what we were going to utilize. And I can tell you that we had very little money sitting on the shelves. You will need to invest somewhere around $250,000 to $300,000, depending on $300,000, depending on what type of equipment, whether or not you have it. If you're starting off from scratch, this will be a definite investment. And some places already have cryo units and microscopes and so forth. But if you're starting from scratch, you will need to do that. Also, when you try and consider buying these equipment, make sure you talk to the doctors and try and see if you can get them to a consensus as to which supplies and which equipment they will be comfortable working with. I think communication with them early on would be something that I would recommend for you to help you decrease your costs. Now, again, before you whether you're starting from scratch or whether you're adding a new procedure to your surgical center, the bottom line is, after looking at all the different factors, will you be making more money than it's costing you to do the procedure? And I think every case is different, so you need to sit down with your staff, your accountant, your administrator, and make sure that you understand what you're getting yourself into before jumping head first. Because I think it's important for you to understand those numbers and make sure that you can make those numbers work. And they will be important also because that will allow you to negotiate with the different companies. Because as I tell the companies, if I can't make it on what you're trying to ask, what I'm going to make and what you're selling these instruments to me for, then it's better for me not to do it. And I think that's important. And the due diligence is, I can't overemphasize it. Now, there are certain things you can control. For example, and things that you cannot. You need to make sure you look at what the staff requirements are in your state. They vary. If you have the opportunity to select a piece of equipment that has multiple uses, as Dr. Pepos already alluded to, little things like if you have an anterior segment cataract machine and a posterior segment vitreoretinal machine, those are two separate capital investments. But that's the short term. The long term is that along with that comes a yearly maintenance fee. Instead of paying one, now you're paying two. Little things like that can definitely help you. You need less staff because to be trained. So that also helps decrease costs. If you can standardize the supplies, some of these equipment, you're able to use the same cassette both for anterior and posterior, and that again decreases the number of packs that you have sitting on your shelves. Work with your vendor, to make sure you have good purchase contracts that make sense, and whatever you do not forget to make sure someone is keeping an eye on your contracts, because routinely the costs will significantly increase if you let your contracts expire. Also, join buying groups, and I'll point that out a little bit better, because there are some buying groups that will help you decrease your cost of the everyday supplies. For case in point, we were able to convince our group of both vitreoretinal and cataract surgeons to use one machine. This requires not having two separate instruments. It saves us, as I already pointed out, on the service contract. We do not require any special trained nursing staff, for example, to be able to put together and break down the machine, and this helps us significantly decrease our costs. As already pointed out, you want instrumentation that is going to help you decrease the space in your operating room, because space is a premium and it's a high dollar space, and you need to do everything you can to differentiate yourself from the local competition. One of the things that we've been able to do is we've been able to increase the number of procedures that we bring into the surgical center. We also look at different opportunities, as Dr. Pepos alluded to, with the opportunity to do research in the surgical center. We are able to combine instruments. For example, we're the few, and we're the only group that has the ability to do endoscopic vitrectomy. Now, how do we do that? Well, our glaucoma group uses it for endocycle photocoagulation, and we've trained our surgeons to be able to do that, and that's one other way to distinguish ourselves from the other surgical centers in the area, and it has helped us, pique the interest of other retina groups to come in and use our facility. Now, as I already alluded to, the buying groups are important, and there are a couple of them. There are many of them. I'm just pointing to that we use, and I can tell you, you'd be surprised the significant difference in cost of simple things like sutures, buying them on your own versus buying them through these buying groups. And I strongly recommend that if you're not on one of these buying groups, you look into it. You'd be surprised how much money you'll be able to save. They've already this choosing the surgeon if you're trying to add someone new into your surgical center has already been discussed. But again, you want someone who isn't the fastest, but again is someone who's reasonable. You don't want the cases, the average case taking them more than 45 minutes, because then you start getting into a situation where your return significantly drops. They've already discussed the fact that it's a good idea for you to call the local nurse at the hospital to get a copy of the preference card and see what the surgeon likes. You don't want a surgeon that's going to try and open, the guy who opens everything on the tray is not the guy you want at your surgical center, because you will very quickly get into trouble. So in conclusion, I think that retina procedures are going to continue to increase at ASCs. I think the primary driver has been our ability to bring a broad variety of cases, and of course the improved reimbursement that has happened. That, in combination with the increased benefits to the surgeon and the patients, have had a dramatic improvement. If you're trying to bring and considering to bring someone in, careful selection of the surgeon and equipment and standardization of supplies can help you add profits to your ASC. And again, there is definitely a potential benefit for the owners of the ambulatory surgical center. Praveen, thank you.
Victor, that was great. Thank you so much. That was extremely valuable information from somebody who's had a tremendous amount of experience. Thank you. For the audience, we are going to make sure that we have a lot of Q&A time, because I know there are a lot of very, very important questions coming in. I would ask you to submit the questions for Mike and Jay and Victor and now Steve. I will try to get to as many as we can. I know that you're very interested with superb questions, so panelists, please be prepared to answer them. Next is Steve Shepard, whom I've known for a long time, who's really one of the pioneers of ASCs. Steve is the managing principal for real estate and operations at medical consulting company, MCG, in Springfield, Missouri. He specializes in providing ASC development and certification assistance, financial analysis, and operations management services to practices and firms in eye care and other medical subspecialties. And having been someone who's worked with Steve for a number of years, I know how experienced and good he is. Steve, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Dugal. That's very kind. Two quick things. I'm fighting a respiratory flu, so if I sound a little hoarse, I'll try to speak up. And secondly, there is an advantage to going last, because a number of the points that I was going to cover have already been made, so we'll be able to kind of accelerate through this set of slides and get to the questions and answers perhaps a little more quickly. I believe there will also be a printed supplement based on this webinar, which I'm sure will be available, and in case there are particular points on my slides you've missed, you'll have an opportunity to follow up through that. I am a consultant, as Dr. Dugal indicated, so I have an active financial interest in the ambulatory surgery center industry, and particularly in the ophthalmic sector. Our company historically has worked very closely in eye care, and about 2/3 of the projects I've worked in have been ophthalmic centers. We won't be discussing anything that's unlabeled, of course, tonight. And I think we've pretty much covered already where we were in 2007. Typically, the only couple of points I guess I would like to make is that the other big changes have obviously been in instrumentation, which have substantially reduced case times and also have reduced the costs associated with things like suture. One thing you'll note here, my numbers I think correspond with some others you've seen earlier, that the ASC facility fees prior to the Medicare reimbursement restructuring that commenced in 2008 For the kind of common procedures, the peels, puckers, holes, and more straightforward detachment repairs, you were looking at average ASC reimbursement rates of $750 to $800. I just want to point out a couple of things. We've been referring primarily to the Medicare rates during the course of the evening, and the rest of my talk does as well. Commercial payers, we touch on contracting as well. Typically, in my experience across the country, reimbursement rates from commercial payers are slightly better than we typically see with Medicare. And also it gives you an opportunity to carve out, if you can, in the negotiations, some of the higher cost supplies, the silicone oil, perfluoron, and et cetera. Secondly, why are there different payment rates? You'll see some of mine differ from some of the previous speakers. If you haven't worked in a surgery center previously, Medicare adjusts the rates geographically, and so your rates may be slightly different than the national averages. My slides refer to the national averages, and effectively what Medicare is trying to do is adjust for wage differences from physical location to physical location. There are about 4 factors I view as being critical for success integrating vitreoretinal surgery into a surgery center. And most of these we've touched on a little bit. The remainder of my slides discuss them in somewhat more detail. As we've noted, the Medicare transition was completed in 2011. The 2012 national average Medicare rate for the common codes is about $1,655. Dr. Gonzalez noted earlier his rates substantially lower. He's in South Texas. Obviously, if you're in New York City or San Francisco, you can anticipate, or Honolulu, you can anticipate the rates to be slightly higher. These codes that I've outlined here include the most common procedures that are typically done in ASCs. All of the vitrectomy codes, pars plana with peels, puckers, and holes, retinal detachment repairs with laser and more difficult cases. In my experience, ASC-friendly retina surgeons can typically bring about 80% of their cases to the ASC environment. The very sick eyes still often get referred to the hospital. Most ambulatory surgery centers try to restrict their patient population to patients with an ASA classification of 3 or less. Occasionally they will do a 4 if the anesthesia provider and the surgeon agree that it's safe for the patient, but those are relatively infrequent. As Mike noted, I think we don't anticipate substantial fluctuations going forward, absent some untoward event. I think we can look forward to ASC reimbursement rates remaining relatively stable for the foreseeable future. I noted that in our experience, on average, commercial payers pay slightly better than Medicare. Across the country, we've seen an average of about 120%, but I would warn you, in your area, it may diverge fairly significantly from that number. I've seen them as low as about 115% in kind of the Rust Belt area of the states, and I'm in Wyoming tonight, and out here in the Wild Wild West, they're substantially better than the Medicare averages. Retina, just one final point, retina has kind of a favorable demographic cohort. Typically younger patients, probably 40 to 50% of the patients are Medicare primary, 50 to 60% have commercial coverage, and while those reimbursement rates tend to be a little better, in particular it makes your anesthesia providers happy, simply because they get paid better from the commercial payers, and they don't get paid much for Medicare cataracts, and so that can be a benefit you might not anticipate. Very quickly, if my slide will load here, we'll run through some of the particular costs. I think we've detailed in a couple of the earlier presentations precisely what you need, and these will give you a benchmark of what I've been seeing in the marketplace for the last 2 or 3 years. The vitrector with an integrated laser or without an integrated laser, but you're buying a laser separately, are going to be in the range of $100,000 to $120,000. We noted a cryo and a light source. The microscope, this is a cost depending on your particular scopes that exist in your center, you may just be able to upgrade and not buy a new one through the addition of an inversion system. Typically, the retina surgeons are going to want a stereo observer system as well. Image capture equipment you may well have. The kind of 3-chip cameras and a digital recorder can be as little as $10,000. If you get into high def everything, you can spend a lot more money. A substantial element are going to be instrument sets, and that's very much a surgeon preference item. So, and once again, in my experience, you're looking at around $220,000 to $300,000 to equip a room for vitreoretinal surgery. I believe Dr. Gonzalez showed $250,000 to $350,000, and certainly I won't quibble with that. The last couple of lines there indicate kind of where I'm seeing surgical pack prices, really just depending on the content, the gauge of instrumentation you're using, those sorts of things. And then finally, if you use, there's a typo there, it should be silicone or perfluoron, and it is an additional substantial amount per case, which by the way is bundled into the reimbursement code for Medicare patients, and so you cannot bill the costs of those supplies separately. You do have an opportunity with some of the commercial payers to carve them out, and I would explore that certainly. Finally, a few other considerations. Well, jumped ahead of myself. I just want to say a couple words about labor, because it's typically true that the impact of labor is overestimated. And we talked about before having an efficient surgeon versus a speedy surgeon. And I would just emphasize that I agree that that's absolutely correct. The cost-benefit decision you're making, since you have an existing center and an existing staff and probably a clinical director that's on salary, probably some billing and collections people that are going to work their 40 hours a week, and a front desk, the question becomes, if you're adding incremental cases at the end of your day or on a day that you're otherwise dark, who would you send home? Well, in this particular case, if you're operating one OR for your posterior segment cases, a circulator, perhaps a surgical tech, perhaps a pre-op and a recovery RN, and maybe a front desk person. So 5 people, say their average fully burdened cost is $40 an hour. By fully burdened, I mean their hourly wage rate plus their benefits. At that point, your marginal labor cost is roughly $200 an hour. Now, that's a substantial number, but the difference between a surgeon that's doing 45-minute cases and the surgeon that's doing an hour case on average, as long as the quality of patient care is equivalent, that 15-minute difference isn't going to make or break the profitability of the vitreoretinal surgeon, and it shouldn't make or break your decision whether or not this is the right person to bring on board. VR can actually exceed a single cataract on profit per case. The clear difference, though, is the number of cases per hour that you're doing. So the revenue per hour you're generating in the operating room, if you're doing 45-minute VR cases or 30-minute VR cases and you're doing 20-minute cataracts in that OR, then the revenue per hour, probably still the nod would go to the cataract surgeon. And I'm kind of rushing through this so we can get to the questions and answers, but there are a few other considerations I'd just highlight. We've talked a little bit about the availability of trained staff, really the two kind of critical people there. Slide's not loading yet. Well, hopefully it loads here shortly. The circulator and the surgical tech, obviously it's going to impact the pre-op and recovery nurses, but the people in the trenches with the surgeon are the surgical tech and the circulator. I think Dr. Pepos outlined a very good approach. There we go. A very good approach to training those two individuals. Obviously, you know, an optimal solution would be to hire somebody or have somebody already on your staff that has some VR experience in a former life. Finally, other things you need to think about is your physical plant set up for general anesthesia? Do you have a medical gases delivery system? Are you going to have to acquire an anesthesia machine and appropriate monitoring equipment, both for the OR and probably the recovery room? Then finally, even if you're not planning on doing general anesthesia, but you bring an anesthesia machine in-house and the medications for it, and you're going to have to set up a malignant hyperthermia cart, train everybody on that. It's not a huge expense, but you can expect to spend $6,000 to $8,000. And then finally, surgeon-dependent factors. I think the other speakers have addressed those. I would just point out that the attitude and adaptability to the ASC environment is significant. One last consideration is your physical plant. With the slower case times, longer recovery periods, if you're doing even a relatively small number of general anesthesia cases, do you have enough recovery bays and in order to handle the patient flow and throughput? It's also, if you're considering building something, you probably want to look at actually building an enclosed patient bay for recovery, just to deal with any potential issues of postoperative nausea in the patients that either had general or an LMA. And so apologize for kind of dashing through this, but I think we all want to get to the questions and answers. And so with that, I'll turn it back to you, Dr. Dougal.
Steve, great. That was terrific as usual. Thank you very much. Let's jump right into the Q&A, and I want to address Mike Romanski first. Mike, and I'd like you to take some time in answering this, because this is one of the most important and misunderstood questions, and this hasn't been addressed in any of the talks. Let's talk about ASC ownership. There are a lot of regulatory implications here, Mike. So take us through this from a ASC ownership for dummies point of view. Tell us what the third rule is. Tell us what safe harbor is. Tell us who's allowed to own an ASC, who's not. Can my mom be an owner? Does my partner have to be an owner? Do I have to be a surgeon? What does that mean? Can you explain all of that to us, Mike?
You mean do all of that in 3 minutes?
Well, we'll give you 5.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to do my best, and then you might want to remind me of a couple of the sub-questions when I'm done.
Absolutely.
First of all, I think that to a great extent, the ASC is a very, very, very safe investment from the standpoint of safe harbors and the anti-kickback law. You know, the focus of most of the real anti-kickback activity have been instances where the physician has an ownership interest in a healthcare provider for which he doesn't provide the services. So, for example, clinical laboratories or radiology practice, MRI, pharmacy, those sorts of things, when the doctor isn't performing the services. We've been able, for the last, it's been now about 22, 23 years since Pete Stark first came up with this bright idea. OOSS and others in the ASC community have been pushing the notion that a surgeon's investment in ASC is a very different type of investment, because the surgeon is actually performing the surgical services, unlike the internist has an investment in a clinical lab or in an MRI scan or in physical therapy services or something like that. The doctor is performing the services. So in essence, this surgery center is an extension of the physician's office. And as long as we're operating within our physician's office, there shouldn't be this concern about physician self-referral. We've been successful for the most part. There's an exemption in the Stark law for investments in an ambulatory surgical center, and there is what's called a safe harbor for ASC investment, and that's a safe harbor, which means that if you comply with all the components of the safe harbor, your investment is essentially it's got the government stamp of approval. You're not going to be liable for civil or criminal prosecution. So what are these components of the safe harbor, the ASC safe harbor? And before getting into those, let me say that there is no requirement that you meet safe harbor requirements. It's totally up to you. If you do, you got the stamp of approval. If you don't, the venture can just be looked at some point by the Justice Department or the OIG. There's been very, very little scrutiny of physician investment in ASCs. But anyway, back to the components of the safe harbor. There's some obvious no-nos. That would be, for example, if you pay an investing surgeon based upon his use of the facility rather than his ownership investment. If 10 doctors each have a 10% ownership interest, they each need to get 10% of the profits. And that can't change from year to year. If one doctor goes up to provides 20% of the referrals, he doesn't get 20% in the next year. Another example of a component of the safe harbor is there can't be, as a requirement of ownership, there can't be a requirement that the doctor refer patients to the facility, even though inevitably they do. But then we get to sort of an odd thing that you were referencing, and you were talking about the 1/3 test. Is that correct, Praveen?
That's correct. That's correct, Mike.
The idea here is that if it's true that a doctor is using this facility as an extension of his office, it should really be something he would be doing in his office. So first test is the 1/3 income test. Is the doctor really a surgeon, or is he somebody who sort of behaves sometimes like a surgeon? And the 1/3 income test basically says that you have to meet all the other components of the safe harbor, but each surgeon investor in the ASC must derive 1/3 of his income from surgical cases. That's professional income from reimbursement, from professional reimbursement. Now, I know there's some confusion because sometimes what the doctor will say, well, we're not going to meet that test because I don't derive 1/3 of my total practice income from surgical cases performed in the ASC. That isn't what's required. 1/3 of your income from all surgery, whether it's in the hospital, whether it's in the ASC, whether it's in the office. 1/3 of all your income coming from that, and you'll meet the 1/3 income test. And I think that probably most people who are on this call are going to pass that test. There's a second 1/3 test, and that says that 1/3 of all cases, surgical cases, have to be performed by the surgeon in the ASC in which he has an ownership interest. And this really is, if this is an extension of your office, you don't have 10 different offices. So you shouldn't have investment in 10 different ASCs. So the idea here is that the surgeon do a substantial amount of his work in that particular ASC in which he has an ownership interest. And that, again, is a sign that he's serious about this being an extension of his office. Again, I come back, Praveen, to the point that safe harbor is not a requirement. Probably 80% of the ASCs out there do not meet the safe harbors, but they are not suspect ventures. But you want to come as close as you can to those tests.
Mike, thank you. Let me not let you off the hook yet. One more question. There's a big influence of hospitals, of course, in ASC ownerships. And with the new healthcare system, the winners are obviously going to be hospitals. How does hospital ownership of the ASC affect the surgeon's ability to buy into to that hospital-owned ASC?
Well, first of all, I want to take issue with your suggestion that hospitals are going to have a significant ownership play in ASCs. We know that it's about 20% of ASCs overall. The 5,300 ASCs, about 1,000 of them have some hospital ownership, or the hospital has a management contract to manage the ASC. However, if you look at ophthalmology, if you look at a survey that OOSS recently conducted, we find that hospitals have an ownership interest in less than about 7 or 8% of ophthalmic ASCs. And I don't see hospitals having a very dominant ownership position going forward. First of all, eye doctors are very independent, entrepreneurial. They've escaped the hospital environment and aren't looking to the hospitals generally as a joint venture partner. And ophthalmic ASCs, and this is very, very significant, ophthalmic facilities typically serve a particular practice, unlike multi-specialty centers that might have many disciplines and have 20 to 50 investors. So when the hospital acquires the ASC, it's presumably acquiring the referral streams of many, many surgeons. That isn't the case when the hospital buys the typical ophthalmic ASC. I know that one of the things that you're getting at is something we've talked about a lot, which is this new phenomenon of the hospital acquiring an ASC and then converting the ASC to the hospital, to a hospital outpatient department, meaning that it receives substantially higher payment for the same services it would have provided the day before in the so-called ASC. First of all, Congress and CMS are looking at this practice, which really is, I think, suspect. And secondly, of all of the 150 or so such conversions, only one has involved an ophthalmic-oriented ambulatory surgical center. I know the other thing that concerns us is that clearly accountable care organizations, which may or may not be a wave of the future, in Obamacare they would, contemplate hospitals insurers being the centers of these new organizations. And I do think it will be a challenge for ASCs to break into those, but we do have a product in which whoever is paying for the service will get more for the money. So we just have to figure a way to break in there. Anyway, that's how I would answer in short form.
Thank you, Mike. That was terrific. Let me ask the rest of the panel a question that's asked of me, and I'm sure all of you all the time. Let me start with Steve and then go to Jay and then Victor. The question is, what is the minimum number of cases, vitreoretinal cases, that are necessary to break even in a surgery center? Steve, how do you answer that question?
Well, my academic training is in economics, so I start out with a bunch of assumptions. But specifically, the answer can vary widely depending on what it's going to cost to equip the ASC to do retina. But here's kind of an algorithm that somebody could follow, and I think that would give them at least a first blush estimate of what the timeline would be and the cost should be. Let's go back to the assumptions that I made and Dr. Gonzalez made in our presentations, and pick a number and say, we're going to require $250,000 worth of vitrector, microscope, hand instruments, other things that we need to get us in the business of doing vitreoretinal cases. And then if, I think the questioner asked about 3 years, so we want to recover those costs in 3 years, basically. That essentially we're going to have a marginal contribution to our operating income, pre-tax, of about $80,000 a year to do that. Say the average vitreoretinal case we're going to do in an ASC is going to have a reimbursement rate of about $1,600. That's somewhat conservative because that's the Medicare rate essentially, and it doesn't give any effect to commercial payers. And let's further stipulate that our disposables cost is going to be about $500 for our pack and supplies for our average case, and it's going to take an hour, so our marginal labor cost is $200. So we've got several pieces now. On the equipment side, we know we're going to have to recover about $80,000 a year to recoup our $250,000 investment in 3 years. On the revenue side, we're going to get paid about $1,600 a case, minus $500 for disposables and $200 for labor. So the incremental revenue from adding a retina case is about $900. Most of our other costs in the facility, within a relevant range of case numbers, are fixed. You're not going to pay more rent, utilities aren't going up, your property taxes, et cetera. None of those costs are going to change. So we're just really looking at surgical supplies and labor. With that, as an algorithm, you need to do about 100 cases a year to generate, that would generate $90,000 in incremental revenue, which is going to recover your costs over a 3-year period and give you a little bit of a margin, both in terms of we tried to be conservative in the estimate of the reimbursement rates, and also there's a $10,000 gap in there in case some of our assumptions vary. But, you know, historically, that's kind of been the number I've tossed out there. If you're bringing retina into an existing ambulatory surgery center and you're not crowding out any of the other cases you might otherwise be doing.
Thanks, Steve. Jay, you've added retina to your surgery center recently. How did you figure how many cases needed to be done to make it break even or profitable?
Well, I followed pretty much the same guidance as Steve just mentioned. The reimbursement around $1,700 a case. We have our cost per cases on averages is going to be somewhere between $500, $550 to $600, for the average case. For a vitrectomy, obviously it's going to be more if you start to add silicone or perfluorocarbons. But we're able to, because we're both a mixed anterior and posterior segment, we did have some cost savings. Again, the vitreoretinal, we already had 2 phaco units, so that helped in terms of just upgrading a unit or getting a vitreoretinal unit, and the cost of the vitreoretinal units really vary tremendously. So that's something we looked at very carefully. And also, we already had staffing, and we had some staff that were working per diem. We had some staff that were working full time. So we were in that ballpark range again, pretty close to what Steve had said. Probably, I don't know, on a conservative, estimate, I would say probably closer to around maybe 400 cases to truly really start to become really profitable.
Thank you, Victor. Anything to add to that?
No, I think that I agree with that. I mean, our break even definitely decreased when we moved from primary retina focus to combined, and that number sounds very reasonable.
So Victor, let me ask you a few retina questions now. Having started working at ASCS in 1994, one of the things that really grated on me was that a lot of people would assume then, I think it's less so now, thankfully, that to operate in an ASC we had to sort of operate cheaply, that we had to somehow do the cheapest thing possible to make things work. What's your feeling on that? We often have to make a choice between devices or instruments or disposables, all kinds of things, and we may think that one is better than the other. We all have different reasonings for different decisions, but there are some that are more expensive, there are some that are cheaper. Do you think that it's a fair thing to say that if you're going to operate an ASC, you're going to somehow have to operate as cheaply as possible?
The answer would be no. I mean, I think as Steve has already pointed out, the cost of the equipment is pretty similar in terms of your capital costs for your vitrectomy units and your microscopes and so forth. So I think that that really isn't the big factor for the cost. Once you decide what equipment you like, I think most of the vitrectomy units out there are exceptional. The important thing really is long term. The thing that's going to erode your potential profits is what type of supplies you have. The case that I gave you. I don't think you need to open every single toy that we can have available to us in order to be able to do a good procedure. And I think that's probably more important. And that's why when you're evaluating retina surgeons, you want to look at that. Is this individual going to be able to perform a quality service with the basic instrumentation that everybody else uses? If he's the type of individual that opens every single pack, whether or not he uses it, I think that's where a lot of the issues come with cost. So to answer your question, no. I think we don't have to do it cheaply. We have to do it wisely and efficiently.
I think that's a really important point, Victor, and thanks for pointing that out. The point is we all have choices. All the equipment now is absolutely exceptional. We've come so far from the time that, Victor, you and I used to train. We used to cut at 400 cuts a minute, and we thought that was fast. But I think at the end of the day, you look at all the equipment as a return on investment. You want to provide the best that you can, and you can do both in an ASC. You can really do the best surgery that I think you can get anywhere. I'd much rather have my eye operate in an ASC than in a hospital, and still be profitable. It's a win-win situation. So the message, I think, is choose what it is that you want to choose and be efficient as possible. And I know that we had done some studies in terms of the overhead and so forth. I think another way to state perhaps what Steve said earlier on in terms of the overhead is not so much who you would send home in terms of labor costs, because at the end of the day, that's the largest part of my overhead. It's over 60% of my overhead. My disposables are never over 20% of my overhead. But it's not so much who you send home, but how you reassign their activity. For instance, if you have something whereby a nurse doesn't have to be standing there next to an equipment pressing it up or down in terms of power, but you can control it with the foot pedal, that's a reassignment that's very profitable and job appropriate. So I think when we consider decisions on equipment, on disposables, so on and so forth, I think the return on investment is something that we really look at to make us efficient surgeons. But thank you, Victor. That's an excellent point. Let me also ask you one other question, and I'd like to get after you answer this, I'd like to get Jay's opinion on this as well. What do you do about really difficult retina cases that come in, and we don't choose what we get, but suppose we get a case that has a PVR, a silicone oil, PFO is required. Do we now have to take that kind of a patient to a hospital that has seen a case maybe only once in 2 months, the most difficult patient to the place that's least experienced? Do we cherry pick our retina cases for ASCs? How does that work for you, Victor? And I'll ask you this, and then Jay, you're next to answer that question. Go ahead, Victor.
The answer is no, Praveen. I mean, I think, as I pointed out earlier, I mean, within our group, we have different skill sets, and we have some surgeons who love those cases, are very efficient, and get very good outcomes. And I think what we do within our group is we have consciously made a decision that, when we have those type of cases, there are certain surgeons in the group that really enjoy them and want them. And they, because they enjoy them and want them, they also tend to be very efficient in terms of timing in the OR. And it takes a little while for the group to get familiar with that, but I think that, we work as a team, and that has helped us, basically do all our cases at the surgical center, with the exception of, pediatric, anything under, under a year, we take over to the hospital. We do have general, we do have the ability to take care of children, but, we just limit our liability, in that way. Otherwise, we would be able to do all the procedures in our surgical center.
Excellent. So you're not cherry-picking your adult cases, Victor. I just want to make that clear. Is that correct?
We are not, no.
Correct. Thank you. Jay, how would you answer that in terms of the type of cases there in your surgery center?
Well, I agree. We don't really cherry-pick the cases. I think the only thing that we have done is our center was doing all cases, anterior segment cases under topical, with a few cases that were blocked, but the vast majority were under topical. So we did make a decision that we were going to not do general cases that require general anesthesia, which are really few and far between. We were still bringing to the hospital. And all other cases we were doing here.
Thank you. Steve, Jay brought up the point of anesthesia. Let me get to you because you've seen hundreds of these things. How does a surgery center make that? Let's look at this algorithmically. The first decision point becomes, do you only do local, or do you do general and local? So the first question is, how do you make that decision point in an ASC for retina? That's the first question. The second question is, how do you make the decision point between who's doing the anesthesia? Is it the surgeon doing the blocks? Is it the anesthesiologist doing the blocks? Do we have a CRNA? How are the anesthesia choices made, Steve?
Well, kind of the first decision of whether or not you're going to do general anesthesia really relates to, is your ambulatory surgery center, is the physical plant set up to handle general anesthesia? Do you have piped gases? Or do you want to bring gases into the OR in tanks? You can do that. It just complicates the process to a certain degree. And so the other point I would make is that there's a little bit of a countervailing impact on the anesthesia providers. Typically, if you're doing commercial patients as opposed to Medicare or Medicaid patients, their reimbursement rates are better for those patients, and they're better still for either general or LMA. So it may be an encouragement to the anesthesia provider, but you also look at what else is required to do that. Do I currently have an anesthesia machine? Is it there just as a backup, or is it something we're already actively using? If we're in a cataract center, you know, quite honestly, a number of the cataract centers I've worked in over the last several years haven't acquired an anesthesia machine if all they're doing is topical and maybe some conscious sedation for the cataract patients. So cost is an issue. As to who is performing or whom is performing the block, that varies widely. Typically, I think I see more retina surgeons doing their own retrobulbar blocks than I used to see cataract surgeons doing peribulbar blocks back in the day when peribulbar was used extensively for anterior segment surgeries. In those days, it seemed as if either anesthesia providers or CRNAs, and probably more in particular, a lot of CRNAs had been trained to do peribulbar blocks and did those relatively routinely in ambulatory surgery centers. But in the retina centers, for the most part, certainly early on, unless you already have an experienced anesthesia provider that is familiar with and has done a lot of peribulbar blocks, that those are, in my view, still done by the surgeon.
Thank you, Victor. Let me get to you. One of the issues that has come up in terms of ASCs and retina surgery is emergencies. How do you handle emergencies that come in vis-a-vis? You told me you don't cherry pick. You do all your adult cases there. What do you do about emergencies?
Well, what we do is, we're not open beyond 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay, so if it's a retinal detachment, I think the literature is such now that if you have a macular detachment, you can wait till the next day and do that procedure. I think the literature will also support the fact that if you have a macular detachment, that as long as you properly consent the patient and give the patient the options of going to the hospital or waiting till the next morning, we can wait and do that as well. So that's usually the way we handle those type of situations. I mean, of course, if it's an infection and you have an intraocular foreign body that you need to get to sooner, we take them to the hospital.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think when you and I were in training, we wouldn't think twice about doing a MAC-on detachment at 2 o'clock in the morning, and now we realize how unnecessary that is, and perhaps even how disadvantaged we put the patient and the staff in trying to do that. And you wonder what is really an emergency. When endophthalmitis comes in, now in most cases we inject in the office. If there's a macular detachment, I completely agree with you. I think there's substantial literature that supports the fact that you can do that comfortably the next day in a proper setting. So I think that issue of emergencies having to be done at that time, it takes less and less of an important role. And Steve, let me ask you, as you look through this, because opening late is a time and a half in terms of paying for at least my largest overhead. Can you ever make money opening late and staying late, or working in the weekends?
Well, there are a couple of issues, Doctor. Yes, you can. I mean, simply because I think if you look at the margin you can make on typical retina cases, if my labor costs went from $200 an hour to $300 an hour, the case would still be profitable. There are other considerations, though. If your staff has started at 6 a.m. With anterior segment cases in the morning, and now somebody wants to bring in a case at 6 p.m., you may have some quality of care issues as well as some staff morale issues. Working on the weekends is not necessarily anything you need to pay time and a half for if you've staffed with some key people that have your surgical tech and your circulating nurse that are competent to do the things that they're doing, particularly for posterior segment cases, but they're not exceeding 40 hours a week. You know, they're taking time off other times during the week. I don't know. You'd almost have to double staff if you were going to try to work every Saturday, but you'd have to have enough people that, you know, were willing to have their weekend be Sunday and Monday that you could staff and OR in a limited number of cases on Saturday. One of the things to watch out for, however, is some states have state regulations that impact the allowable hours of operation of ambulatory surgery centers. In some cases, it may be as simple as refiling with the State Department of Health that we're changing our hours of operation to include Tuesday evening from 5 to 8 or Saturday from 7 to noon. And there are a few administrative details you'd want to look at as well as the economics.
Thank you. Have you seen that model work, Steve, where ASCs are open that late or on the weekends with stepwise staffing like that?
In relatively rare cases. Generally, those are larger centers, and you know, probably most frequently they're multi-specialty centers where they're treating a younger population, where Saturday hours or evening hours, you know, or late afternoon hours are very, very popular because they're shooting at a working age population. So in my experience, it's been relatively rare. Also, it's usually been more of a seasonal kind of effect than something where you'd plan on being open 50 Saturdays a year. Oftentimes, the last quarter of the year, you know, the fall of the year, tends to be a busy time for ambulatory surgery centers. And so with the cooperation of the nursing staff and in the states where they can do that, they may schedule a few Saturdays or they may schedule a few long days where they overlap staff just to handle the anticipated increased case volume.
Thank you, Steve. Victor, let me get back to you. I'm intrigued by your buying organization, which I think is a great idea. We have obviously a lot of costs and needs and so forth with stains, PFOs, and everything else. Do you put everything that you buy through the buying center, Victor?
You know, the answer is I try and do that, yes. But I'll tell you, sometimes, you know, that's why you can't just do it blindly. So, you know, for the most part, the buying centers.
Of course, we don't use that word. We say in a masked manner.
Yeah. You know, what we do is we do intermittently check because don't always believe that you're always going to get the best price. You know, say for example, you know, if you have a good relationship with a company, you know, chances are you may be able to negotiate a little better price than the buying group. So I think, you know, you need to sort of explore that, and every once in a while, especially if it's something that's being, you know, utilized significantly and there's a volume, you may again go outside the buying group and go directly to the manufacturer. And quite often, you know, we've had some success in reducing our costs that way.
Yeah, and I think that's a terrific idea. And wouldn't you say that, you know, when you and I started, everything was done in a hospital, but wouldn't you say that the companies that we have now, the vitreoretinal companies, the Bausch & Lombs, the Alcons, even the companies that are coming in now, like the Grease Harbors and so forth. I'm sorry, I'm blanking out the Dorks and so forth, are paying a lot more attention to what's efficient in an ASC, and that really wasn't even a consideration before. I know B&L has a machine that has both anterior and posterior segments, you know, in their device. I think those major companies now have a major recognition in realizing the efficiencies that are required for an ASC. And do you find that that's becoming more and more apparent to you, that there's more of a nod towards their design towards the ASC?
No, I absolutely, Praveen. I mean, personally, I use the Bausch & Lomb Stellaris PC, and it was a conscious decision for us to use that one. And the reason is that when we were interested in bringing in the anterior segment docs, we wanted to make sure that, again, we brought in an instrument that would provide us with everything we needed. As I already told you, we Texans have that Dell mentality, and that is we don't want our reusables to be sitting on the shelf, because that's money sitting on the shelf. Well, if I have two different pieces of equipment, when it's not being used, that's again my money sitting on the shelf. I prefer to have my money working both anterior and posterior, and right now the B&L instrument is the only one that provides us with that dual flexibility.
Mike, let me not let you get away too long here, and let me ask you something. So everybody's charged now to have an ASC and so forth, but there's a huge barrier that comes in front of some of us, and it's known as the CON, or Certificate of Need. So what is the CON, Mike, and how do you overcome it, and who has to deal with it? Well,
if you've seen one state CON law, you've seen one state CON law is what I always tell clients. It's a regulatory program. Well, there are a couple of regulatory things that an ASC, a starting ASC, has to think about. One is getting Medicare certified so that you're eligible for Medicare payments. Second is state licensure. If the state has a licensure law and requires that you meet a separate set of requirements other than the federal ones, you've got to meet those. And the third one is what you mentioned, the Certificate of Need laws that about maybe 20 states still have. And these are rules that essentially say that a new healthcare facility cannot be established unless there is a documented need for such facilities in the community. Who decides if there's a need? Generally, a CON agency that's comprised, or a CON board that's comprised of hospital officials and bureaucrats who have tended to side with the hospital industry. So in some respects, the CON laws become sort of a franchise protection thing for the hospital industry. That said, most CON laws have exceptions for physicians' offices, and many times you can drive an ambulatory surgical center through this physician office exception if, for example, the only people using your facility are doctors who are in the medical practice that owns the center. As I said, it's hard to generalize about CON laws. They truly vary from state to state. These laws can change frequently. And if we're talking about CON as one of these troublesome things, we also ought to mention that you need to be mindful of other regulatory requirements that could come out of nowhere. It might be a state prohibition on doctors referring to facilities, or requirements, for example, that facilities pay a provider tax. So those are the other sorts of things you want to be mindful of as you're contemplating the venture.
Great. And Mike, nowadays we are injecting a lot, or we still do some lasers, and I often get asked this question. Perhaps you can answer this for me and the audience. If there's an ASC next to my office, why wouldn't I take my injections to the ASC to be injected there at a higher reimbursement? That's the first question.
Well,
the second question is, why would I not do the same for my lasers?
Well, I think first of all, it's the same. I'm going to answer. Both get the same answer. There is no reason not to bring your procedures over to the ASC, except for convenience sake. There are instances where the ASC isn't located in the same building. Many instances where that's the case, and so it's not convenient. The doctor doesn't want to take the time to bring the one elsewhere. But let's face it, most of these procedures don't require sterile ORs. So they can be done it could be done in the office or the ASC. I want to mention something, though, that is really hot off the presses, and I alluded to this, in my talk, and that is that the government's starting to get wise about this. And actually, MedPAC is considering a proposal that could get considered as soon as during this coming lame duck Congress, limiting what a hospital gets in reimbursement to the difference between what a surgeon would get doing it in his office doing it in the hospital, meaning basically reimbursement for laser procedures like the argon, like the YAG, could be reduced from $200 from $400 to about $20. I mean, it's ridiculously obtrusive. If this happens on the hospital side, certainly nobody's going to allow a situation where ASCs are paid more than hospitals. So if reimbursement in the hospital side gets reduced for lasers and these office-type procedures, so too will they get reduced on the ASC side. This has not happened yet, but it's something to keep our eyes on.
In ending, I would like to. We've talked about how good a situation we have with ASCs and retina and what opportunity there is. I'd like to turn it around to the end. I'd like to start with Steve and then go to Jay and then go to Victor and then end with Mike. Tell me what you see as being the single biggest challenge in the next 5 years for retina entering the ASC, and keep your comments fairly short. Steve, if I can start with you.
Well, I would say two things. One is, unlike cataract surgery, I think it was alluded to earlier, retina surgeons have considerations for the nature of their referral sources. And one of the very practical problems I run into when we're looking at developing ambulatory surgery centers with a retina component is, what am I going to do to my referral base if I affiliate myself with one ambulatory surgery center? And so that's unique as compared to recruiting a number of anterior segment surgeons into an ASC. Really, the second thing from the surgery center's perspective is, do I have times when I'm dark where I'm selling air to bring in the retina cases? The alternative, if the alternative is to increase my cataract volume, or probably even some of the other anterior segment cases, typically the surgery center is going to move in that direction. So finding available OR time that's convenient with the retina surgeon's schedule is kind of the second thing I would allude to.
Thank you, Steve. Jay, what do you think is the most important challenge for VR in ASCs?
I agree with what Steve said. I think that most ASCs are looking to increase their utilization. I think that by adding retina, you'll do so. I think that you have an excellent trained staff. It offers so many advantages to the patient. But I think that Steve brought out the challenges from the retina surgeon's perspective in terms of concerns of referral. I know our retina surgeon is delighted that, there are many times where she can add on a case, it may be at the end of a day, where otherwise she wouldn't have gone to a hospital, and it's just so much better for the patient and for all parties involved.
Victor, how about that, the concern with referrals? I hear that all the time. If you have a busy cataract surgeon and the retina surgeon operates in that ASC, the busy cataract surgeon's ASC, that somehow they may cut off the referrals. How would one handle that? I know you're in a different situation, but what kind of advice would you give to a surgeon who's got those concerns?
Well, I think that is very important, and one of the most important things that I would recommend would be for them to go and talk to the referring doctors before they actually do this, because sometimes it's very different when you approach them before you do it and just say, hey, look, this is what I'm thinking of doing, what are you, and sort of get some feedback so you can understand what you're getting yourself into. Quite often when you do that, it's better than the doctor hearing about it at the hospital cafeteria and then getting upset about that. But also, one of the things that has helped us is, try and do something that can differentiate you from the rest of the group that no one else is doing. For example, as I pointed out earlier, we're using the Endo-Optics endoscope, and we're one of the few that can provide that type of endoscopic vitrectomy. If you can do something like that where everybody thinks that that's a worthwhile, valuable procedure, sometimes you can overcome issues like that.
Mike, this is the last question. I'll end with you. Tell me, and take some time, because I want to make sure that people have a balanced perspective of this webinar, and I don't want this to just be a cheerleading type webinar. I want you to take a little bit of time, maybe about 5 minutes or so, and tell us what you think on the negative side are the most important challenges from a regulatory basis for vitreoretinal surgeons and ASC, for vitreoretinal surgery and ASCs in the next 5 years.
Okay. This is going to be probably mercifully a much shorter answer than you're anticipating. I'm trained as a lawyer to look for the negatives, and I don't see a lot of them. I really don't. I think that for the most part, adding VR to the surgery center doesn't really change most of the regulatory issues at all. So you're looking at what are the challenges facing the ASC industry. I mean, I do think we're going to have no problem preserving the right of physicians to own and refer their patients to ASCs. I don't think that problems like quality reporting are going to be a big deal. I have to be concerned about payment rates always. But if I look at the last 10, 20, 30 years, we have managed to stave off reductions in payment for the most part. And so I think that the downside may be that after having seen retina reimbursement in the ASC increase by 100%, 80% over the last 5 years, that's going to level off. Maybe it'll be a couple of percent a year. It's conceivable. Maybe there'll be years where there won't be an increase. But if the hospital gets an increase, we will get an increase, which means that we've got a pretty big player on the healthcare lobbying scene pushing for adequate payment. The other thing that I would mention is, and this is really a state and local issue, that if you're developing a new center, if you've got an existing center, you need to be mindful of some of the tricks that the hospital industry will pull sometimes at the local level. Again, trying to ban physician ownership, make the CON laws tougher, impose provider taxes, that sort of thing. I think all of the other problems, all the other challenges, they're challenges, but they are absolutely surmountable. I remain very bullish on the industry.
And Mike, thank you. And I've been absolutely privileged to be part of OOSS for a number of years, and been privileged to be working with you, Mike. So a lot of things that you're talking to us about are things that OOSS has done, and I know you have championed every one of them. So the significance of what you just said, I just want to repeat, is that we've aligned ourselves to sort of be benefited by really what would have otherwise been a major competitor in the hospitals. If the hospitals benefit, we benefit. So we're basically using their lobby for our benefit, which is a remarkable position to be in. And I think there's nothing that'll happen from that but good stuff for vitreoretinal surgery and ASCs. And quoting you, and I know you like to say this, but this is the one thing that I want to leave the audience behind with, is that in this healthcare crisis, this, in my opinion, will absolutely succeed because we're part of the solution. We provide more efficient care, better care with less money. We're absolutely part of the solution regardless of the party that comes in. I would like to now close this webinar. I'd like to thank OOSS for helping organize it. I'd particularly like to thank Bausch & Lomb, who has partnered with OOSS to bring this on, who's really shown the foresight to bring us all together. I'd like to thank all the panelists, Victor and Jay and Steve and Mike, for a fabulous job that they've done. And I really appreciate all the leadership that all of you have shown in what you've done with ASCs. It benefits us. It benefits our patients more than ever. And that's, at the end of the day, that's the most important thing, is to benefit our patients. And it does that, and it does that in a way that is cost efficient, safe, and efficient. So thank you very much for being here. I want to thank the audience for their profound questions, for their interest, And we will be seeing this in print. Ophthalmology Management, which has also put this together and has organized this, is going to have this in print very shortly. It will also be available on demand very shortly, so please look for it. I think this will be a very useful document to have either in the website or in print. Thank you all very much.